All right, kiddos, today we are going to talk about European colonization, mostly focusing on the things that happened before the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. If you look here at our learning target, you should be able to identify multiple perspectives, more than one point of view regarding all of the events that led up to the Boston Tea Party. And the reason why you need to do that, you need to do that in order to understand how each event built up to that point. You need to understand both sides and how it built up to the point of Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party, and eventually the American Revolution. Now, if we go back in time just a little bit, we remember that it wasn't just Britain, it wasn't just England that was trying to settle and get resources and land in the Americas. It wasn't America yet, but we can call it North America. Because if you look at this map, obviously France and Spain were busy doing their thing as well, right? Now, if you look at this, Spain was obviously very busy. They had a whole lot going on. And you can still see some of their influences in the places that they had started to colonize before things kind of changed. And you can still see some French influences in some places, especially like New Orleans. You see a high amount of French influence in New Orleans, in this area, before things kind of changed in that. But the reason why I would imagine we focus mostly on England is, well, they ended up taking over all of it. And we're in North Carolina, which was part of the original 13 colonies. And so that's where most of our history is going to come from, as far as like this part of time comes from. So that's why we kind of look back at this, and we don't really look at the French colonization or the Spanish colonization of anything. We kind of focus on that. And it's also in our standards. So if they told me to teach something else, then we would. Heading up to the Boston Tea Party. We'll get there soon. Now, I have not lost my mind, because like this is either one of those really weird events where I'm in the Matrix, or I am not. And some of you are in here with me. Who remembers me talking about the French and Indian War? See, I'm not crazy. I know I did not just teach the last class of the day. We taught this to 3 people. And the crazy thing about the French and Indian War is it wasn't what it sounds like. It wasn't French and Native American people going at it. It was France and England. Again, now if you look at the anchor chart, I wrote that down. I'm going to put that on the whiteboard. I think this pops up on yours if I'm not mistaken. Is it on your screen? You should. If you've already written all this down, guess what? You don't have to write some of this down today. French and Indian War. Whoa, goodness gracious, this thing is brand new. It was fought between France. I hate when this thing does that. There we go. The French and Indian War fought between France and England, who both, I guess I could put the word both in there, who both had Native American allies. So if you notice, over here in France, they had this access area to this river, and the English really wanted that access because that gave them more access to trade, more access to resources so they could make more money. And so they kind of started brawling over all that, which is kind of wild to think about that. And here's something that we need to talk about. War costs a lot of money. It's not free. You have to have troops. Troops need clothing. Troops need guns. Troops need ammo. Otherwise, you just stand there and yell pow pow at each other and the other person falls down. I don't think that that's going to work out very well. When you actually do go pow pow with the real guns and ammunition, somebody's going to get shot. When that person gets shot, they need a doctor to take care of them. They need medicine. They need a tent to sleep in. They need warm clothes. They need blankets. They need wagons to move things around. Because again, we don't have some giant Terminator with a cannon on his shoulder walking around, I'll be back, and shooting people on the battlefield. It doesn't work out that way. Maybe in the movies, but don't steal that either and make a movie about the Terminator and the Civil War, because it's on video that I thought of it first. And it's just, there's so much cost involved, and you got to start thinking, like, somebody is going to eventually run out of money, right? It's like playing Monopoly. Eventually you run out of money, and you can't afford to pay for the war. So after all of the fighting, all of the money borrowing, remember, like, England and France were both just absolutely broke after this, they signed the Treaty of Paris. Now, the Treaty of Paris was an agreement that was signed between France, not in the Indians, which it sounds like it, between France and England. It gave England all of that land. If you remember back when we looked at this picture here, all of the land, even way back to the beginning, all of the land that all of this, France no longer owned. That is one expensive way to lose a war, isn't it? So, France, when they signed the Treaty of Paris, gave up the rights to all of that land. And if you notice, so again, remember, wars cost a lot of money. At the end of the war, England and France signed the Treaty of Paris. And what that did was it signified a couple of things. Number one, the war's over. We are done fighting. Please do not shoot at any more of my people, and I won't shoot any more of yours. And number two, France lost all of its land in North America, which is a huge thing to lose. Now we're reaching new stuff that we didn't dig into very deeply because we stopped. But how in the world do you pay for a war? Well, typically they would start taxing people. Now, taxes are when you add a little bit of extra money on to goods and services that goes to the government to pay for things like wars and roads and infrastructure and things of that nature. And if we're all very honest, the English just paid, I think we looked it up, 140 million pounds. They spent all of their money and some to pay for this war. Is it wrong for them to then say to the colonists, hey guys, we just spent all of our money defending our land in America. We got some new land that you're going to be able to work on and make money, but for right now, we need you guys to pay a little bit of taxes. Is that an unrealistic thing for them to ask? That's no more unrealistic than him asking her to borrow markers after they used all of hers in the project, right? So England came out with something called the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was a tax on paper goods. Whether it was a deed to a house, a birth certificate, a magazine, a newspaper, any type of legal document, it was a tax on paper goods. On the surface, the Stamp Act definitely sounds like something like, that sounds like a fair deal. They paid for the war, you helped them out. Right? However, there was something going on beneath the surface that really upset the colonists. And it goes down to this very bottom line right here. They weren't happy with being taxed without representation. What does that mean? To be represented. Who in here? Anybody here on student council? Nobody in here? Okay. We all voted for people in the student council, right? They represent us as a school. There's no way that Mrs. Reap and Mrs. Davis and Ms. Klein could listen to every single student in the school talk about what they would like to do to change the school. So we voted on people. There's a set of kids that go in there and they meet. And they say, I think this would improve the school. I think this would be very good to do at Christmas time. I think this would be good to do during Thanksgiving. And we do small little projects that help other people, whether that's the children's hospital, right? Or we have the stocking drive, and I forget where that's going. Like, we have different things that are pretty amazing that we do, but we don't have all of us trying to do that at once. The colonists had no one in the British government that had any control over the colonies. So if the British government was like, Forget it. We don't need to fix any roads. I just drove here the other day. Our roads are fine. The colonists might be, whoa, hey, time out. Like, we definitely need some funds to fix the roads. The roads over in the colonies are really bad. And they would be like, oh, thank you for letting us know, because guess what? They weren't in the colonies. There weren't like live feed cameras, no YouTube shows, no Twitter feeds, no Facebook. Look how bad my road is, right? And it took forever for news to get across the sea by boat. And by that time, who knows what happened, right? If they're making all these important decisions about laws and taxes, don't you think the colonists deserve somebody to say, I think that's just about fair, or I think that's too much? I think the colonists had a good point. And it's taxation without representation. And we'll get that down in our notes here in just a second. So you had some people that were upset. And this is going to sound very familiar. People upset with things that were going on. What did they do? They started boycotting and protesting. Wow, nothing's changed in however many years that's been, right? Because that's still what people like to do when they don't like what's going on. They like to boycott and protest. And so they got so crazy that they even burned paper. Oh, you want us to use this paper? Yeah, I'll use it as a fire. And they would burn in the middle of the streets because they got sick and tired of putting up with the British Stamp Act. All right, now this is what I like about learning about history. Up until this point, I feel like the 13 colonies kind of did their own thing. You had the Puritans in the upper part of the northern colonies that were like, we're better than everybody else because we worship and do things the exact best way, right? Leave us alone or get out, which is what they didn't like about the king, which is really hilarious. Then you had the people in the middle colonies. Different religions, different countries, different languages spoke. They had like shoemakers, shopkeepers, cabinet makers, glass makers, people in factories, people working on ships, people fishing. They did a little bit of everything, right? Then down south, they had lots of people on plantations, and a lot of people in the south owned slaves. Some of the people in the north were like, yeah, I'm not really down with that slave thing. But they really stayed out of each other's business, didn't they? They were just 13 separate colonies. This is kind of unique. They got together at the Stamp Act Congress. Man, my voice is toast. At the Stamp Act Congress. And they were unified. And they said, hey, listen, this Stamp Act is garbage. We need to be one united 13 colonies. And if we all tell England the Stamp Act is garbage, I think it's going to make a bigger impression than just random people protesting and random people boycotting. If we all are together on this, it's going to make a much bigger deal. Kids, this is one of the first times that we ever were like united. You're starting to slowly see the seeds of the United States being sown here, aren't you? They're starting to think, you know what? I don't know that I like this England nonsense. We're the 13 colonies. How dare you tax us without representation? And they're starting to come together. It's just faintly there, but it's there, and it's not much longer until they break away. Well, guess what happens? With enough pressure, guess what England did? They caved, and the Stamp Act was gone. They got rid of it. Now, these guys right here are one of the reasons why the Stamp Act was gone. The Sons of Liberty. If you're at home, you just need to know that they intimidated tax collectors. In class, they're going to talk a little bit deeper about that. With all of the protests, all of the boycotts, we're like, past the Sons of Liberty. All of the boycotts, the crazy Sons of Liberty, right, doing their insanities. England finally said, we give up. We repeal, we get rid of the Stamp Act. However, England was about as petty comes, and I'm here for it. I think this is hilarious. In the same day that they got rid of the Stamp Act, they enacted a new act called the Declaratory Act, which said we're allowed to make any law we want to and pass any tax that we want to. Do you think this is going to end well? No. You would be correct.